Isaiah performance tonight. May I extend my appreciation?
My father will be delighted, Mr.
Captain James Kirk, Starship Enterprise.
Hello. We're here to discuss the fictional life of James Tiberius Kirk, captain of the USS Enterprise, well, multiple Enterprises, in the prime universe of Star Trek. Specifically, we want to look at Jim Kirk the man, the personal motivations, the tragedies that affected his life. Who was he? What drove him? He wanted to explore space, sure, but what toll did that take on him? What price did he have to pay? Did he get what he wanted out of life? Did he have any regrets? There are a surprising amount of personal tragedies in Jim Kirk's life. So, is his life a sad story? Tragedy? Or is it something else? Let's find out.
Starfleet, this is Captain Kirk. Beam that officer up now.
You're probably wondering why I'm filming in my basement. It's a visual metaphor, right? For how often we release videos at Trekspertise. Yeah, you get it. Perhaps the darkest chapter of Jim's story occurred early in his life. When he was a young teenager, Jim was witness to a genocide. He was living on Tarsus 4 at the time, where a food crisis had developed, and the governor, a 23rd century eugenics enthusiast, had 4,000 of the colonists he deemed undesirables killed in order to, ironically, prevent the spread of mass starvation.
What were you 20 years ago?
Younger, Captain. Much younger.
So was I. But I remember.
Jim was one of only 9 witnesses. It isn't obvious when you look at Captain Kirk, but the events of Tarsus 4 must have left a deeply embedded mark on him. Jim went on to attend Starfleet Academy, where he was bullied for years. After graduation, Jim was assigned to the USS Republic, where, in a particular moment, he had to log an incident report that did not look favorably on his friend and former instructor, Lieutenant Finney. The report resulted in Finney's career being held back. This incident ruined that friendship. Jim was promoted to lieutenant during this time period and brought back to Earth to serve as an academy instructor. It was there he would meet a student named Gary Mitchell. The two would become fast friends. Gary even tried to set Jim up with a blonde lab technician who Jim nearly married. Canonically, we don't know who this is, but retconning this blonde lab tech to be Carol Marcus would make more than a little sense, as we will see. Sometime later, Jim became romantically involved with Janice Lester. Their relationship fell apart when Janice began to feel that her career had stalled, where Jim's hadn't.
I hoped I wouldn't see you again.
On account of the fact that women weren't allowed to command starships in the 23rd century.
I never stopped you from going on with your space work.
Your world of starship captains doesn't admit women. It isn't fair.
No, it isn't.
By the way, Star Trek still hasn't fixed that bit of canon. Yeah, that's still canon. The franchise has just chosen to ignore it. Anyway. In 2257, the USS Farragut, the ship Jim was assigned to next, was attacked by the dicronium cloud creature. The encounter killed 200 of the crew, for which Kirk blamed himself. Jim saw so much death in his young life. As we might have seen, sometime before Jim was assigned to the Enterprise, he met Carol Marcus, an up-and-coming scientist. The two began a serious relationship and bore a son, David, but their careers were taking them to different places. So Jim and Carol made a choice, as many do, and chose their careers over staying together as a family. Jim would not see David again until David was a grown man. That's 2 personal relationships Jim has had, where his career has taken priority. It's a trend that will continue. Jim would rise quickly through the ranks to command the USS Enterprise at the tender age of 32. And even though he began to explore the great mysteries of the universe from the captain's chair, personal tragedy haunted him. In 2265, Jim was forced to hunt down and kill his then best friend, Gary Mitchell. Gary had been undergoing psychic transformations and harming Kirk's crew. and he had to be stopped.
All else a god needs compassion! Mitchell!
In 2266, Kirk bore witness to the final death of one of his heroes, Roger Corby, the Pasteur of archaeological medicine, whatever that means.
Tell me, Captain Kirk, did you order the soft lights especially for the occasion?
Later that year, the daughter of the genocidal governor of Tarsus IV, Lenore Caridian, tried to kill Jim and another officer, Lieutenant Kevin Riley, both the last remaining survivors of the Tarsus IV massacre from when Jim was a teenager.
Become a floating tomb, drifting through space. The soul of the great Caridian, giving performances to every star he touches.
In 2267, Kirk's ex-friend, Lieutenant Commander Benjamin Finney, whose career Jim had inadvertently set back, attempted to take revenge on Jim.
I'm a good officer, as good as you. I've watched you for years. The great Captain Kirk.
That revenge took the form of a faked death and a court-martial. If Finney had been successful, Jim's career would have been destroyed.
Officers and gentlemen, captains all, except for Finney and his ones.
Later in 2267, Jim was nearly bested by a genetically enhanced human warlord named Khan, who had previously been frozen for 300 years. Jim managed to come out on top, but the encounter would have dark implications for the future. In the same year that Jim met Khan, Jim's own brother was tragically killed on Deneva by a flying psychic parasite.
Sam. It is my brother. Was my brother.
Later, adding deep insult to misery, Jim fell in love with a kind, wonderful woman during a time travel adventure to 20th century New York. But not only did he have to let her die in order to preserve the timeline, he was there when her tragic death happened. This is not an exhaustive list. Kirk's life was filled with adventure and dark times. Being in Starfleet meant making sacrifices. In Jim's case, the biggest sacrifice was family, that of Carol and David Marcus. This choice must have begun to take a toll on Jim. And, of course, the massacre of Tarsus IV alone is enough for a lifetime of PTSD and therapy. But all of this, up until now, could be considered the good part of Jim's life. At least he had his crew, which he considered his found family, in lieu of a biological family with Carol Marcus. However, in the next chapters of his life, promotions and circumstances would separate him from that found family. It made Jim long for the coldness of space and the warmth of friends. He would spend years trying to rebuild those first early years, that golden time he spent aboard the Enterprise. After Jim's original 5-year mission aboard the Enterprise ended, he was promoted to Admiral and stationed at a desk on Earth. After a few years of this tedium, Jim conspired to use a planet-wide emergency, the V'ger incident, to get himself back in the command seat of a starship. If he could get his friends, his found family, back together too, then all the better.
Starfleet just signaled your transfer of command orders, sir.
Jim got what he wanted, command of the Enterprise.
Captain, I appreciate the welcome.
But he had to bump a perfectly good captain out of the way. He got his crew back too, even Spock. And even Dr. McCoy, who Jim had to basically conscript.
This was your idea, Tim Bones. I need you.
These were desperate, almost selfish measures, but they worked. We aren't sure the exact amount of time, but Jim seemed to have commanded the Enterprise again for a number of years after the V'ger incident, from the mid to late 2270s. But then he briefly retired. That's right, Jim Kirk, Starfleet to the core, retired from Starfleet after fighting to get back into the captain's chair, perhaps for the love of a woman, Antonia, who we know virtually nothing about. This is perhaps the most mysterious decision Jim Kirk ever made. Was it solely Antonia that drove his decision to leave Starfleet? Or did Starfleet force the issue of his retirement somehow? Or was Jim interested in the possibility of a biological family, like the one he missed out on with Carol Marcus? We just don't know. Things with Antonia didn't pan out, however. and eventually Jim returned to Starfleet, this time to another desk job managing Starfleet Academy cadets. But just like his previous Earth-based desk job, Jim wasn't satisfied unless he was in the center seat on the bridge of a starship, exploring the unknown. And as fate would have it, he got another chance to get back out there. Another crisis appeared, the Genesis incident.
What exactly is Genesis? Well, put simply, Genesis is life from lifelessness.
And Jim took advantage of the situation to get back aboard the Enterprise. It was then that Khan, the genetically enhanced human warlord, attempted to take revenge on Kirk. During this crisis, Jim was incidentally reacquainted with his son, David, now an adult, and his former lover, Carol Marcus. And in the process of tangling with Khan, Jim's best friend, Spock, died. His found family now had a gaping wound, and his biological family, in the form of his son David, was a stranger to him. The contrast between choices that Kirk made in his life, between career and family, were made stark and tragic. For Jim, from now on, exploring space would never be the same again. But instead of grieving the loss of Spock, Jim was presented with an opportunity at resurrecting his friend. Jim must have realized that maybe the act of exploring space by itself wasn't the magic in his life that he thought it was. Instead, maybe the real magic that gave his life meaning was family, particularly his crew, the found family that he knew. So, in an act of desperation, Jim stole his former ship, the USS Enterprise, and he, along with the rest of his crew, traveled to forbidden space to resurrect Spock. And they did, but in the process, Jim had to destroy the Enterprise, the very thing that facilitated the connection to his crew.
What have I done? What you had to do. What you always do. Turn death into a fighting chance to live.
And, also during this moment, Jim's son David, who Jim was only just getting to know, was killed by Klingon interlopers.
Klingon bastard, you killed my son!
David's death, and the stark choice between career and family, bore down on Jim during this time. After trying twice to return to the space adventure life he once knew, we see the price for that return was getting steeper with age. Jim shared a few more final adventures with his crew. They saved Earth from a dangerous alien probe by resurrecting, through time travel, the humpback whale species. It was an act of heroism for which Jim and his crew were rewarded with a new replacement USS Enterprise, another chance for his crew to stay together. But the death of Jim's son, David, left a dark mark on Jim.
I've never trusted Klingons. And I never will.
Which festered into a prejudice. He had blamed Klingons for David's death.
I can never forgive them for the death of my boy.
That prejudice reared its ugly head during a moment of interstellar crisis, in which Federation-Klingon relations were being completely rewritten. Jim had to face his prejudice head-on.
People can be very frightened of change.
And he found that he could overcome it.
You've restored my father's faith.
And you've restored my son's.
Very soon after this, Jim retired. He spent some of his retirement playing at extreme sports like orbital skydiving. Perhaps he still sought some of the adventure of his old life, something to fill the void. In 2293, Jim vanished and was presumed dead, in the midst of an emergency that occurred during the public launch of a new Starship Enterprise, during that ship's encounter with an energy ribbon called the Nexus. But Jim didn't die, not then. What actually happened was that the Nexus, an extra-dimensional timeless void, trapped Kirk. Jim would spend 78 years in the fantasy of the Nexus, dwelling on the great what-if of his life. We don't know if Jim felt all 78 years of that time frame. The Nexus is an inscrutable place. Did he specifically dwell on Gary Mitchell, on the genocide of Tarsus 4, the death of his friend Spock, on Carol Marcus? No, he didn't. Instead, he dwelt on the lost romance of Antonia, a chapter of his life we know nothing about. Perhaps it speaks to the fact that in his twilight years, after a lifetime of adventures with his found family, that Jim maybe was interested in a biological family, at a chance at sampling what he missed with David and Carol. Maybe not having that kind of family was his biggest regret. Ultimately, Jim left the Nexus after being visited by Captain Picard, agreeing to help Picard with a new crisis.
Just who the hell are you?
He's James T. Kirk. Don't you read history?
But in less than an hour free of the Nexus, Jim was killed by Picard's opponent, the Elorian Tolian Soren, killed in a fall. The twilight of Jim's life was strange and long. In that end, Jim was left to dwell for nearly 80 years alone, separated from his crew in a sea of memory and fantasy, only to die in a fight next to a stranger, saving strangers. Taking a step back to look at Jim Kirk's life, the theme of career versus family feels most obvious, and the struggle of that choice is especially exasperated by Jim's vocation as an explorer. Many real-life explorers, we know, sacrificed a comfortable personal life of family and routine for the thrill of pushing the boundaries of human knowledge. Ernest Shackleton, Antarctic explorer, comes to mind as a strong Kirk analog. Although Shackleton, an affable leader, had a family, he risked his life repeatedly for his crew and to help fill in the edges of the map, leaving his family alone for years at a time. Shackleton died doing just that, away from his family on a mission of exploration. Ernest Shackleton had what Kirk didn't, and still made Kirk-like career choices. But now that we see the outlines of Kirk's life, perhaps we see that his failed relationship with Carol Marcus and the loss of his son David might have been the great tragedy of his life, and perhaps it pushed him to embrace more fully the unconventional family that was his crew, which he returned to again and again, even at the expense of his most beloved starship, the Enterprise. He seemed to realize the importance of his found family even over his dream of being in Starfleet. Perhaps Jim Kirk was a kind of family man, after all. Welcome to the credits, everyone. I have two entire human beings here with us to discuss all things James Kirk. The two of you are here because you are publicly James Kirk people, like TOS James Kirk people. Chris, a little bit younger, definitely centers himself and his Trek fandom on TOS. Is that correct?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, without a doubt.
And Brandon here, a little bit older, grew up sort of in the afterglow of the original series, and that's Kirk was like the guy you wanted to model yourself after.
Right. Very true.
So,
yeah.
Okay, so now comes the fun part. The Antonia bit in Star Trek Generations, one of my favorite films of the franchise. I recognize that the Nexus needed another pass in the writing phase. But the whole bit with Antonia was just such a left field thing for a character at that point in time. We should have, as writers, should have had a good handle on. So I want to ask you guys to rewrite the Nexus scene a bit. What should it have been? How do you line that up more with the character?
So, Kyle, you know that when I was in shortly, just a couple years after Generations came out, I was flabbergasted by what they did to canon. And they didn't break canon. They just added things in the empty spaces where there had been no information. And I was astonished that they had created a world in which Kirk quit Starfleet. Kirk quit the very thing that was the essence of his being. What on earth would drive him to quit? Then he almost marries someone and settles down with someone. So she had to have been astonishing, given some of the astonishing women that he has already had in his life, that he was actually going to say, I will plant my flag and with you and stay with you. And then he leaves this incredible woman to go back to a job that we see him in Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, flying a goddamn computer console and having a midlife crisis. Like, what on earth makes him quit? Who is this extraordinary woman? And why does he leave her to go back to a job he hates? I was like, I had to solve that. And so I was writing a novel, and I had done 100 and some pages, and I'd gotten to the point where, I can figure out why Kirk quits. But when I got to Antonia, I stopped because I couldn't figure out who this woman was. I later was working on Cosmos, and of course, our executive producer was Brannon Braga, who was one of the co-writers of Star Trek Generations. And I sat him down over beers one night and just like went into him basically saying exactly what I just said. And he said, Brandon, you've already given it more thought than I ever did. In 10 minutes, I can tell you gave it more thought than we did. We just threw that together. And I eventually reached out to Ron Moore, and he gave me the same. It was basically the same sort of thing. They were, of course, under like such tight deadlines with All Good Things that they just threw something together. And my thought was always, okay, one, why did you throw something together when you already had such a rich history that you could have drawn from? You had Carol Marcus, you had Edith Keeler. There was no need to invent Antonia, especially when you were going to give her a cursory glance and then move on. So she remains still this quintessential, she has to be huge. You have to accept the Nexus and you have to accept what Kirk did in canon. So obviously she was an incredible, phenomenal, deep, rich thing in his life that continues to be completely unexplained. But yes, they never should have done that. They should have been Carol Marcus and David. He should have gone back and said, this is what I lost. This is what I traded. This is what I gave away. And as we saw in season 3 of Star Trek Picard, where we finally saw Picard be able to finally have that human family, that biological family that he didn't even realize until that point in his life that he'd been yearning for, that was a perfect opportunity for Kirk to go back and say, what did I give up and what can I repair and what can I have now that I couldn't have at the beginning?
Yeah, nice. Okay. Chris.
Here's how convincing your thesis was for me, because when I started thinking about this, what I immediately went back to was right after my maternal grandmother died. And she lived in Southern California, went down for the funeral, gave a eulogy in her backyard. And I spent so much time in that house. I basically spent an entire childhood in that house, that playground, the backyard. It was a magical place to me. It was a safe place. It was a warm place. And being there again with a constant reminder of the absence of the people that had made it special was a rather personally profound experience for me. You know, it's just like, I finally understood you can't go home again. I never really got that until then. And then I finally innately understood exactly what that means. And I can't help but think that when the bulkhead in front of him of the Enterprise B disappears, he's back on the bridge of the original Enterprise, and he is among the people that he loves the most. And, you know, we think back, like when I think of going to my grandparents' house, and there's sort of like this idealized version in my mind of, you know, grandpa's sitting watching the TV, grandma's in the kitchen, maybe she's making a pie, and it's just like, oh, I wish I could be there again. And with Kirk, I honestly believe that it would be kind of an idealized version of that 5-year mission again. And it would be enough of a convincing simulation that it would really take the emergence of someone like Captain Picard to consciously pull him out of it. But it would be very, very difficult for him to leave, because this is where he has wanted to be his entire life. You know, he says it in the movie that, you know, don't let them promote you, don't let them transfer you, don't let them take you anywhere that takes you off the bridge of that ship, because while you're there, you can make a difference. And not only does he always want to make a difference, he wants to make a difference with the people that have made a difference to him. So I think that, it might be kind of a nostalgia trap, sure, but that's where he found the most meaning in his life, beyond the biological family, you know, the brothers that he forged between Spock and McCoy, and the deep, meaningful connections that he had with all the other members of the command crew. That's where I think he wants to be always, and that it's a tragedy that he can't be there anymore.
That's a good answer, and it's one I didn't expect.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, thinking about how the movie could have played out if Picard shows up and is the bridge of a Constitution class vessel, that would have been quite a thing to play around with. That actually would have been a really perfect visual, you know, connecting the generations together.
And he wouldn't totally know what's going on, and things maybe don't quite align, and he doesn't realize until the very, very end of the line that he conjured this. This is what he wants the most, and I have to take him away from this.
That would have been strong.
Mm-hmm.
That would have been strong. My personal rewrite is closer to Brandon's, in that Picard shows up at that little cottage, and he goes inside, seeing people in the window, and you see the back of David's head sitting at the table, and Kirk is opposite, and they're just talking. And the implication is that David didn't die, and James could have spent some more time with him, getting to know him in the fantasy. And I think that would have been hard to leave, maybe, But...
Oh, well, I've got a slight amendment to mine then, because not only is it the 5-year mission again, but David's on the bridge with him.
Yeah,
that's the clue.
Generations, it needed another pass, gentlemen, and I hate to say that because I love the movie. I truly do.
It's one of those movies that has aged very well, especially because it is all about aging itself. And so the older I get, like, I did not think much of it the first time I saw it, and then I still have issues here or there with it. But the older I get, the more I realize, oh my God, this movie speaks to me. This whole, holding time while you have it, and all this kind of stuff. And I realized, I was thinking just today of the line about I have fewer days ahead than I have behind, and that's my life as well. And that is a astonishing, sort of sobering thing to recognize about yourself, and rewrites how you live in the moment now.
Yeah.
Another thing that occurred to me while doing this is that there's a chance that the writers of Strange New Worlds and whatever comes after can retcon the Nexus in a way and add to it to sort of fix this, right? He spends 78 years, linear years, inside the Nexus. This can't be the only thing he's playing with, right? And if we revisit like a future Kirk for some reason, for whatever reason, and see him in there, maybe we see a different fantasy. Maybe we can help button up some of this. This is like an open problem, I think, that's perfect for Star Trek to solve. It loves to solve these kinds of like canon issues, and I think this isn't the last that we've seen of Kirk in the Nexus.
So. That's an interesting thought. It's funny because what's been in my head for a long time is that yes, he spent 78 linear years in the Nexus, but the movie only depicts such a small fraction of that's all he gets. I think it kind of adds to the potency of the tragedy of his death that he does kind of finally get a chance to rest a little bit, but it's cut short because, once again, duty encroaches on his feelings of responsibility.
Yeah.
But I certainly wouldn't mind seeing more of him.
I also think there's the whole Guinan dimension. There's like an echo of Guinan left there. Like if there's an echo of Kirk still there, like that,
right?
I would want to play with that as a writer,
Right. Yeah. It may have been a silly plot device to be able to have an expositor explain what the heck's going on in the Nexus by having that echo of Guinan in there, but it's there. So you could easily say, okay, there's no canon breakage whatsoever to say that there's an echo of Kirk hiding in there.
My knee-jerk instinct to Strange New Worlds Season 3 is to have Spock time travel forward, wind up in the Nexus, and get counseling from an old Kirk in the Nexus as a reversal of what happened in the 2009 Abrams movie.
That would be cool.
Spock's.
Or what if the echo of Kirk in the Nexus is actually a fragment of his soul, and all they need to do is reunite it with whatever Section 31 has?
Jeez.
All right.
Stop saying these things out loud. We don't need to give people ideas. People are listening.
All right. Well, let's wrap this up because I've played the credits out. Thank you guys for joining me. Chris, tell us who you are and where people can find you.
Yeah, Chris Clow. You can find me on the platform that shall currently not be named at CHRASCLOW. I mean, I don't really. It's not that I don't want to say it. I just don't.
It's
know
Q,
what
right? It's called Q.
Yeah,
right?
there you go. Yeah, that works for me. And Discovery Debrief, a Star Trek podcast. We recently recapped the entirety of season 2 of Strange New Worlds, and our good friend here, Kyle Sullivan, was a guest on several episodes. He also joined us for a bunch of episodes recapping Picard season 3. If for some reason you have not yet watched Strange New Worlds Season 2 and you wanted to go through it episode by episode and see what a bunch of other Star Trek fans thought of it contemporaneously, then check out the show. We also reviewed Star Trek Resurgence, the new video game, which is very solid.
And Brandon?
I make hopefully a lot of TV shows and podcasts you love, but you really can catch me every day on TikTok at Stay Curious, my friends, where I post daily history and science content in between the TV shows and the podcasts.
遠い将来を考えてみようよ